Not to overhype today's video, but this is without a doubt some of the best work I've done in Kerbal Space Program in a long time, and I'm not exaggerating. So welcome to Controlled Pairs Gaming, where we are all about helping you find those epic moments in your favorite creative games, just like Kerbal Space Program. And this massive, wobbly contraption that you see lifting off right now was a ring station that I was inspired to make to fulfill a variety of roles in low Kerbin orbit. So let's talk a little bit about today's mission. If you recall, in our last big Kerbal Space Program video, I traveled all the way to the moon in the Galahad 2 and I landed a crew of Kerbals on the surface, then I returned. Well, if you remember, during our return, we actually left a little lander in orbit around the moon, and because space junk is an unacceptable reality of space travel, I have devised a series of contraptions and ultimately this long mission to go and retrieve that junk and put it on a suborbital trajectory so that it encounters the moon and is then no longer in orbit around the moon and causing us all this danger during our space flight. So step one in this multi-layered mission was to put a station in orbit around Kerbin, in low Kerbin orbit, right at 150 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin in an equatorial orbit, and with the new Breaking Ground expansion finally allowing the existence of ring stations, I, like so many other Kerbalnauts, decided that I was going to put a ring station in orbit around Kerbin, which sounded like a simple proposition at the time. Little did I know, some 5 or 6 hours later, after experimenting with a ton of different designs and going to Reddit and elsewhere to try and get information on the best way to go about doing it, I finally got it done, but man was it challenging. And the design that I went with ultimately used a series of rotors and a bunch of SAS modules all attached to this large lifter stage, and right now you see that orbital or that circularization portion of that lifter stage withdrawing from my space station, because I wanted to do it all in one launch. I already knew this was going to be a really challenging mission because of all the different steps to get all the way to the moon with the vehicle that you're going to see next, and so I didn't want to waste a bunch of time constructing a space station in orbit. Instead, I wanted it to be done in one launch. And so because the space station was so large, I ended up connecting it to my lifter using this large truss system. And so those long girders that were slid down the long axis of the ring were actually attached to the station using struts. And now as we deorbit the circularization stage of my station, of my lifter, we can finally see the station in all its glory. So we get those solar panels extended, and we'll talk more about each little piece of the station here in a little bit once we get rendezvoused with it with our next craft. But right now you can see that it definitely has a ring, it has all those solar panels, and here on the end it's got what I call the toolbox. So it's rotating around right now. We've got an escape capsule on the far right, and then the toolbox itself is 4 different tools, each one affixed with a docking port so that I can send spacecraft up here and retrieve those different items and take them into orbit. And we'll talk more about those tools here in a second. You can also see I have a robotic arm on the space station. So this is something I wanted to try out since the Breaking Ground expansion finally allows a robotic arm to be constructed. I used pistons and servos to do it, and you'll see it in action here momentarily. Okay, this is what I'm legitimately excited about. I have sort of a love affair with SSTOs. For those of you that may be unfamiliar, an SSTO is a single stage to orbit spacecraft. That means that it takes off in whatever manner that it's designed to, but that it reaches orbit without separating any pieces of its body from its fuselage. So there's a lot of reasons for this. Mostly it's cheaper, theoretically, if you're able to recycle or save pieces of your spacecraft rather than throw them away or discard them. And in Kerbal Space Program, it's kind of just a fun engineering challenge. So it's worth noting that there's actually never been a true single stage to orbit spacecraft in real life, although efforts like the shuttle and the Buran in the Soviet Union were both similar to an SSTO in that they're attempting to recycle portions of that craft, but still they required boosters. So a single stage to orbit spacecraft in this sense, and for the purposes of my mission, will be going all the way to orbit and then achieving a low Kerbin orbit, circularizing, and then rendezvousing with our space station in order to refuel and get some equipment, and then go all the way to the moon and dispose of that debris that we have in orbit around the moon. I think it's worth noting also that SSTOs and KSP take a ton of effort to design. So this is actually the 11th iteration of this specific SSTO, and I've designed it for this mission and for several others, and it's got some modular features that you're going to see here in just a second. But it was an enormous undertaking that took hours and hours and hours to get right, and then ultimately we ended up with this. So here we are in low Kerbin orbit, and we open up our cargo bay to reveal that there's actually 2 NERV nuclear engines inside the cargo bay. And you might ask, what's the purpose of doing that? Well, it turns out that in the flight model in Kerbal Space Program, if you have an exposed NERV engine, or indeed a lot of other of these big, bulky, flat surfaces, it induces a tremendous amount of drag on the aircraft. So I solved the problem of having all that excess drag by storing them inside the cargo container, the cargo area, where they will not generate any drag. And by doing that, I'm able to reduce the total number of Rapier engines that I was using all the way down to 4, which means I'm burning less gas, and it also means that I can achieve a higher rate of speed before I cycle those Rapier engines into closed cycle mode and start burning through my oxidizer, which is what I ultimately need to power those Rapiers and get into orbit once I leave the atmosphere and I enter the vacuum. So it's kind of just this little efficiency trick that I found to be super useful, and it also gives me an excuse to have kind of what I think is an aesthetically appealing little orbital process and take them out of my cargo container, dock them with the rear of the spacecraft. So it's just cool. All right, so having now installed those NERV engines on our SSTO, we're now performing rendezvous with the space station that we just launched. And if you're interested in how to conduct a rendezvous or how to dock, there's tutorials for both of those all over YouTube. I actually spent some time a few years ago making one of my own that's been really well received. And so if you're looking to try to do something just like this, you can go ahead and click that card that's on the top of the screen right now, and it'll help teach you how to do that. So having successfully rendezvoused with the space station, it's now time to try and dock with it. And this was the first time that I was using robotic arms to dock. And so I go ahead and I lower that, I use the piston to extend itself out towards our spacecraft. And I get the SSTO, the Endurance Block 2 SSTO all lined up. And then I start worrying about my translation and my rotation with respect to the space station, and I make sure that my direction of travel is centered right on that target indicator on the nav ball, and I start sliding in. Well, guys, it turns out that the breaking ground parts and that the DLC expansion is not designed to allow you to use robotic arms to dock, and this thing was just a wobbly, bouncy mess. But after some finesse and after messing with it for God knows how long, I ultimately got it lined up. I disengaged SAS to allow the docking port's magnetic features to take over, and finally successfully got docked. And what a beautiful sight it is. For the first time, we can see our Endurance SSTO finally docked with our space station, and we get kind of a tour where we get to show off the robotic arm and how it's managed to connect itself to the spacecraft. We see our toolbox over here on the end, which is carrying our claw, a lifeboat tug, a drill, and all sorts of other neat stuff, and finally the escape pod on the end. And sure enough, we've got our ring rotating, so any Kerbals on board get to enjoy some artificial gravity. And the Cupola module there at the very end will enable us to look down on the surface and enjoy the awesome sights. So now that we've got all docked up, I cut it out, but we did refuel the SSTO, so now we're all fueled up. And now I'm using that toolbox, I'm rotating that servo around to make sure that I've got the tool that I want positioned correctly. And I, of course, want to use the claw tool, so I'm going to rotate it around so the claw tool is oriented in a way that makes sense for my spacecraft to be able to grab it. And then I open up that cargo module, and yes, we have a robotic arm on the Endurance SSTO. So remember, this thing is it's designed to do my heavy lifting in and around low Kerbin orbit, also at the moon and Minmus. And because I expect it to be the workhorse of my fleet, it's got to be modular. So between the station and this SSTO, they complement each other very nicely, because this SSTO can take off, come all the way to the space station, use its robotic arm that has a docking port on the end of it to approach and grab tools from the space station and then go do work and then return the tools here or take them all the way down to Kerbin. And so it works out really, really nicely. And for those of you who might be trying to make robotic arms of your own, whether they're on a space station or a spacecraft, just keep in mind that it's finicky. It's really, really challenging. Some advice I've got for you is first to pre-program a few different sequences into the KAL module so that you can extend and retract the robotic arm in ways that make sense or position it in ways that make sense. And then also to make sure that you do not have auto strut engaged, because it causes a bunch of vibration whenever you're extending these pistons out and manipulating them in kind of finicky ways. And then finally, whenever you are docking, disengage SAS, and you might be tempted to say to right click the head of your robotic arm and control it from that location and use the control from here feature. I don't recommend that, because with as much as the parts flex as you kind of maneuver around, it just doesn't work very well, and it ends up bouncing all over the nav ball and having your SAS kind of go haywire. So I absolutely recommend that you just control from the cockpit and instead move your camera around so that you can eyeball where that robotic arm is in space. And now you see here we're burning towards the moon, finally doing our translunar injection. We get to see a nice Kerbin sunrise, and we also have the moon off into the distance. With that burn complete, we start flying all the way over to the moon, and what's left to do is arrive at the moon, perform mooner capture, which is happening right now. We've still got plenty of gas, plenty of Delta V remaining with our 2 nerve engines. And with mooner capture complete, there's still the business of locating that debris that we still have in orbit around the moon and performing another orbital rendezvous, and then ultimately another dock, which will be completed with the robotic arm and using the grabber module. So here we arrive at the ascending or descending node. We perform one small burn to reduce our inclination to 0, and then we manipulate the location of our target intersection until we successfully get our rendezvous. Then we orient at our target, making sure that we are not moving laterally with respect to the target. Once we're oriented at our target, we burn towards it and increase our velocity to it, and then we turn around and face retrograde so that we're prepared to kill off any lateral velocity that we incurred during the rendezvous. Guys, rendezvous took me, weeks, months, who knows how long to finally master. I've been playing this game for years and years and years. Fortunately, guys like Scott Manley very early on held a lot of our hands through the process of learning how to do this stuff, and if it wasn't for guys like him and other content creators, I don't know if I'd still be playing the game, because the barrier to entry is just so high that if you don't know how to do stuff like this, it's less enjoyable, and it's just really tough to learn it unless you've got someone to teach you. So with that said, if you're struggling through that, ask questions down in the comments, and myself and others who have been playing the game for a while are happy to help. So with our rendezvous complete with the debris, that little lander can from the Galahad that we see down below, we get our robotic arm extended and we prepare to capture the little bugger and put it on a suborbital trajectory, which is just a fancy sciencey way of saying crash it into the surface of the moon so we don't have to worry about it floating around in orbit anymore. And for those of you that missed that episode where we used this little lander, I highly, highly, highly recommend you check it out. The Galahad 2 mission was my first Apollo-style mooner landing, where I got 3 Kerbals all the way to the moon, put one down on the surface, deployed a bunch of science collection outpost deployables, and a little rover all in one trip to the surface. It was really cool, really big mission, and that's linked on the top of the screen right now. As we finally approach the lander with our claw activated, and we capture it with a silky smooth rendezvous and dock. Now that we've captured our debris, we orient the spacecraft retrograde with respect to our orbit, and we do just a real small burn to make sure that the lander is now on a suborbital trajectory, and then we disarm the claw and allow that lander to float away from the claw. It fulfilled its purpose well, and now it's gonna rest peacefully at Mach Jesus speed on the surface of the moon for eternity. As we close up the claw, we pack up our robotic arm. We'll go ahead and retract that all the way back into the cargo bay, and then close up the cargo bay, and we'll prepare for our translunar burn, our trans-Kerbin injection, so that we can head all the way home. So I am actually kind of running low on gas at this point. I'm kind of doing some Delta V math, and I'm thinking whether or not it's worth trying to go back to the space station to return the tool. Well, in testing, I never landed with any of the tools in the cargo bay of the SSTO, and so I had my reservations about attempting it for the first time during a live mission, but nonetheless, I was out of fuel, or at least close to running out of fuel, and I just didn't have time to do another rendezvous. I couldn't be bothered to do another rendezvous and try to return that tool. And so instead, yes, we exit the moon's sphere of influence. We capture Kerbin. We reduce our apoapsis and periapsis into the atmosphere to perform aerobraking. We stow away our nerve engines inside the cargo bay. And finally, even though we've still got the claw inside our cargo bay, I elect to go ahead and attempt to aerobrake and ultimately to land back at the Kerbal Space Center with the claw inside. And if it breaks, hey, it's, you know, we'll send a bill to the KSC and we'll have to replace it and take it back up to the space station on our next mission. Well, after a couple of aerobraking passes, we finally managed to get on a suborbital trajectory and re-enter Kerbin's atmosphere. It's a beautiful evening re-entry. We can see Kerbal Space Center in the distance. Still getting a lot of heating effects as we lower ourselves down through the atmosphere, but ultimately managed to make it safely. To get nose on the runway, switch our rapiers over to air breathing mode and use the last bit of our fuel to get ourselves all the way to the runway. Line it up right on the numbers. Deploy our chutes and destroy the claw as we set it down. It's okay, we're going to pretend we didn't see that part. Hey guys, if you like this, then I know you're going to like the next video. Here's some tips to creating awesome robotic contraptions using the Breaking Ground DLC. And then finally, stay tuned to the channel. Make sure that you're subscribed because I'm going to go into some great detail on how I designed the Endurance SSTO from this video. And I will see you guys in the next one.